Why did a muddy crossing on the Thames outgrow older centers of power? Settlements such as Londinium and Verlamium, later Verulamium, held far greater early prestige. Nothing about London's dominance was inevitable. To walk its modern streets is to walk directly above a buried history of fire, revolt, and abandonment. In the years following the Claudian invasion of AD 43, the answer lay in logistics, trade, and geography. Rome required a dependable river crossing, supply point, and trading hub to anchor its new province. From these pragmatic origins emerged Londinium. Yet, its survival was never a simple, continuous ascent. This is the story of a commercial settlement that weathered the ashes of rebellion, post-Roman decline and urban retreat, and eventual medieval reinvention, to become the political and economic heart of England, and later Britain.
Why did a muddy crossing on the River Thames outgrow older seats of influence? To walk the modern streets of the capital is to walk over a buried history of fire, revolt, and abandonment. The broader British Isles were deeply connected to the continent long before the legions arrived. Southern Iron Age tribes exchanged tin, hunting dogs, and captives for Mediterranean wine and luxury goods. The Catuvalauni, expanding from the north, and the Trinovantes to the east, controlled important routes and exchange networks through which British wealth moved. Their sprawling territorial strongholds, at sites like Londinium and Verlamium, later Verulamium, held far greater early prestige. They minted their own coinage, stamped with the names of influential local kings. Yet, the specific location of the future capital remained peripheral to these established hierarchies, existing merely as a tidal, marshy frontier. Julius Caesar had launched a brief reconnaissance expedition to the island in 55 BC, probing the edge of a wealthy and unfamiliar land. Returning a year later, in 54 BC, his legions pushed further inland and crossed the Thames against fierce resistance from native charioteers. Despite this military feat, they did not stay to occupy the territory. Over the following century, British client kings fostered diplomatic and economic ties with the expanding Roman world, exporting agricultural surpluses such as grain, cattle, hides, and iron. However, the Thames served primarily as a frontier or contact zone between regional powers, rather than a fixed political border. The riverbanks consisted of shifting gravel banks, dense oak woodlands, and wide tidal mudflats. There was no established native port or urban harbour already dominating the crossing. In the years following the Claudian invasion of AD 43, the answer to this historical problem lay in marching legions and wagon trains. The advancing Roman military machine relied on continuous chains of provision to sustain its momentum across unfamiliar terrain. Tens of thousands of legionaries and auxiliaries consumed immense quantities of grain, olive oil, and equipment. Moving these supplies overland through hostile, forested terrain was slow, dangerous, and inefficient. The river network offered the most efficient alternative for a conquering army. Securing a reliable crossing over the Thames was a necessity for the subjugation of the island, providing a supply point and a transit hub to anchor the new province. The construction of the first Roman bridge across the Thames was a triumph of engineering that permanently altered the local geography. While the exact methods remain a matter of deduction, archaeological reconstruction suggests military engineers drove timber piles deep into the tidal riverbed. They created a structure capable of supporting marching columns, cavalry detachments, and heavy supply wagons. This single piece of infrastructure redefined physical movement by creating a crucial crossing point for a decisive share of north-south travel. It transformed a desolate stretch of marshland into one of the most important transit corridors in the new territory, laying the groundwork for everything that would follow. New gravel roads radiated outward from the river, carving through the ancient woods to connect the expanding frontiers. Watling Street struck out towards the northwest, cutting a direct path toward the Midlands and Wales. Ermine Street drove straight north, where these arterial roads met the northern end of the Timber Bridge. An opportunistic boomtown began to organically form. It was not a formal colony for retired veterans, nor did it possess the rigid grid planning of a traditional military foundation. Londinium began as a chaotic riverside encampment, driven by the pursuit of silver and foreign goods as merchants, freedmen, and camp followers flocked to the muddy banks. The early waterfront emerged as a labyrinth of timber wharves, mud-slicked alleys, and hasty clay and timber storehouses. Daily life was defined by constant movement and grueling physical labor. Dock workers slipped on wet timber planks as they hauled shipments from the holds of shallow-draft coastal vessels. They unloaded ceramic amphorae filled with Betican olive oil, imported fish sauce, and Gallic wine. The air smelled of river mud, raw leather, and wood smoke from dozens of bakeries and blacksmith fires. Coin flowed rapidly through the unpaved streets, drawing a highly transient and incredibly diverse multitude of faces to the water's edge. Surviving inscriptions and burial records tell of a cosmopolitan society gathering on the fringes of the empire. The crossing drew merchants from Gaul, auxiliary soldiers from the Rhineland, and enslaved people brought from across the Mediterranean world. Native Britons also migrated to the riverside, drawn by the prospect of wage labor and the allure of exotic goods. Women managed taverns and food stalls, catering to the sailors, carters, and merchants who drove the local economy. Slaves labored in specialized workshops along the gravel roads, producing shoes, glass vessels, and iron tools to meet the demands of a rapidly expanding populace. In the busy quarter, near the bridgehead, clerks and money changers operated from simple wooden benches to manage the influx of foreign coin. A clerk might carefully press his signet ring into a tablet of warm wax to seal a debt contract, documenting transactions that tied this muddy outpost to the wider Mediterranean economy. Many of these tablets, preserved in the waterlogged soil near the Walbrook stream, reveal a highly literate mercantile environment that the Roman state quickly recognized the utility of this thriving river crossing. They turned it into a place where taxation, grain requisitions, and military shipping could be coordinated. By the later 1st century, Londinium increasingly functioned as one of the principal hubs for imperial administration and commerce. This rapid ascent, however, was violently interrupted. In AD 60 or 61, the brutal treatment of the Iceni tribe in East Anglia sparked a fierce rebellion. Following the death of the client king Prasutagus, Roman officials ignored his will, confiscated his lands, and publicly humiliated his widow, Queen Boudica. She led a coalition of disaffected Britons, including the neighboring Trinovantes, against the occupation. The rebel forces first descended upon the veteran colony of Camulodunum, destroying the buildings and killing many of the inhabitants. The insurgent army then turned south. They marched down the Roman roads toward the undefended port on the Thames. The provincial governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was far away, engaged in a military campaign against the Druidic strongholds of Wales. Receiving urgent news of the uprising, he rushed back down Watling Street to Londinium with a small cavalry detachment. He surveyed the sprawling, unfortified streets and assessed the vast numbers of the approaching rebel force. He made a cold calculation that prioritized the survival of the wider imperial presence over the lives of the merchants. He determined that the streets could not be held without a fortified perimeter and sufficient infantry. He ordered his forces to retreat. The civilian population was left to face the rebellion alone. The ensuing destruction was severe, and historical accounts suggest a brutal outcome for those unable to escape the town. The archaeological record provides a vivid physical testament to this event. Excavations deep beneath the modern city of London consistently uncover a thick, continuous horizon of scorched red earth. This destruction horizon shows a town devastated by fire, with large areas consumed by the flames. The intense heat baked the clay walls of the timber shops into hardened ceramic. It melted imported glass vessels into deformed lumps. The waterfront was devastated, temporarily broken as a place of exchange. Yet, the geographical advantage of the river crossing remained too useful to discard. Following the military suppression of the Boudican revolt, Roman authorities invested heavily in reconstruction. They conceived a new urban layout, not as a chaotic boomtown, but as a carefully planned administrative and commercial center. A strict grid of metalled roads replaced the muddy, organic alleys of the earlier streets. The architecture transitioned gradually from simple timber construction to solid masonry and brickwork. This rebuilt layout was designed to project an image of permanent, unshakable Roman order across the newly conquered province. At the heart of this newly ordered grid stood the Forum and Basilica complex on the elevated ground of Cornhill. This was an immense structure, eventually expanding to rank among the largest civic buildings north of the Alps. The Basilica served as the Great Hall of Justice, financial oversight, and civic administration. Inside its cavernous interior, magistrates presided over law courts. Meanwhile, a tax official meticulously weighed silver coin and sealed records to sustain the marching armies. The adjacent forum provided a colonnaded courtyard for public gatherings, political declarations, and the tightly regulated exchange of luxury goods. A grid of this scale required an extraordinarily capable network of storage to keep its inhabitants fed and functioning. Solid timber quays were built out into the Thames, advancing steadily into the deeper water to accommodate larger cargo ships. Stone and timber warehouses behind the waterfront stored imported grain, olive oil, and wine. The authorities also committed resources to maintaining public health, constructing elaborate networks of timber-lined drains to channel waste away from the thoroughfares. Sprawling public bathhouses were erected near the river and across the hills. Deep inside these complexes, a slave labored in stifling heat to stoke the subterranean hypocaust furnaces. Thick smoke drifted from the chimneys. Above ground, merchants and officials relaxed in the heated pools to discuss politics and profit. A proper Roman center also demanded spaces for public entertainment. On the northwestern fringes of the grid, a large timber and stone amphitheater was constructed. Here, the local inhabitants gathered on wooden benches for spectacles that could include gladiatorial combat, animal displays, punishment, and civic ceremony. The domestic architecture reflected a highly stratified social hierarchy. Laborers and artisans crowded into closely packed timber buildings and workshop dwellings. Conversely, a growing elite established comfortable lives in substantial residences along the pleasant banks of the Walbrook stream. These homes featured painted wall plaster, underfloor heating, and intricate geometric mosaics depicting classical myths. The religious spaces were equally rich. A subterranean temple dedicated to the Eastern god Mithras served a secretive congregation of merchants and military officers who gathered in the windowless sanctuary to partake in shared banquets. The open, expansive confidence of this golden age could not last indefinitely. Around the turn of the 3rd century, the physical character and psychological atmosphere of the streets underwent a clear shift. The Roman world had entered a period of prolonged political instability. To secure the inhabitants, an extensive stone wall was constructed around the landward perimeter, enclosing roughly 330 acres. Built from thousands of tons of Kentish ragstone transported down the river estuary. It was over 2 miles long and featured a deep ditch. This barrier firmly separated the urban core from the rural farmland. It was a statement of civic pride, but it also reflected a growing sense of military insecurity. Coastal raiding by northern European tribal groups was becoming a persistent threat. The crossing was slowly changing from an open port into a walled stronghold. This protected status made Londinium a prize for ambitious men. During the late 3rd century, a naval commander named Carausius seized control of Britain, defying central Roman directives. He used the walled enclosure as one major headquarters within his wider breakaway regime. He struck coinage to project his own legitimacy and pay his forces. Although this usurpation was eventually crushed by troops loyal to Rome, it highlighted the growing political fragmentation of the classical world. The 4th century brought further physical restructuring. A riverside wall was constructed to seal the waterfront behind a continuous ring of masonry, and heavy stone bastions were added to mount defensive artillery. While the walls projected strength, the civilian life within was changing. Long-distance shipping networks were slowly shrinking, and wealth shifted away from the urban grid towards sprawling rural villa estates. A mason might be seen levering a finely carved block of ragstone from a ruined public building, systematically reusing the high-quality material to reinforce the aging defenses against looming external threats. The provincial elites increasingly relied on localized agricultural production rather than international shipping. The end of Roman Londinium was not brought about by a sudden siege or a single cinematic battle. It unfolded as a slow, complex process of institutional breakdown. Throughout the late 4th and early 5th centuries, ambitious generals repeatedly stripped the island of its field armies to fight continental civil wars. Crucially, the regular flow of newly minted silver and gold coin from the continent completely ceased. Without a fresh supply of coinage to pay the civil service or the remaining soldiers, the monetized economy faltered. The breakdown of organized food supply, taxation, and market exchange made large-scale urban life increasingly difficult to sustain. The traditional marker for the end of Roman Britain is the year AD 410. Later, historical texts suggest that the Emperor Honorius sent a letter instructing the local leaders to look to their own defense. Modern historians debate the exact context, intended recipients, and meaning of this document. The collapse unfolded gradually through military withdrawal, fiscal breakdown, weakening imperial support, and forced local adaptation. Deprived of state backing, the intricate urban machine of Londinium ceased to function. There were no funds to clear the timber drains, repair the crumbling bathhouses, or maintain the great wooden bridge. The poorer citizens dispersed into the surrounding countryside, forced to adopt a life of agricultural subsistence. Londinium was quietly abandoned. Over the following centuries, nature aggressively reclaimed the silent ruins. The carefully engineered Walbrook stream became choked with debris, turning the central valley into a marsh. Saplings took root in the cracking basilica walls. A thick deposit began to accumulate over the abandoned streets. This layer, known to archaeologists as dark earth, is one of the most evocative physical signatures of post-Roman urban change. It is a rich soil formed from rotting timber buildings, decaying thatch, accumulated domestic waste, and wind-blown dust over centuries of abandonment. Streets of the classical town were slowly buried under this dark soil, transforming the grid into an overgrown wilderness enclosed by decaying stone walls. The incoming Anglo-Saxon settlers favoured a radically different way of life, largely avoiding the densely packed stone ruins. the towering remnants of Roman Londinium were entirely alien to their timber-building culture. Early medieval English poetry frequently references such classical ruins, imagining the crumbling masonry as the mysterious work of ancient giants. However, the walled area was not completely devoid of human presence. A solitary monk might cross the broken Roman paving to serve early ecclesiastical sites like St. Paul's Cathedral, and scattered occupation persisted among the rubble. Yet, the main secular inhabitants chose to build elsewhere. They established an open trading settlement along the Strand, roughly a mile to the west. This riverside site was known as Londinium. It was an undefended, sprawling market spread across the gentle gravel slopes leading down toward the water. The economy of Londinium was remarkably robust, driven by a resurgence of shipping across the North Sea. Frisian and Frankish merchants navigated their shallow vessels up the Thames, beaching their boats directly on the shingle shores to unload their cargoes. A trader would haul fine, continental pottery, glassware, and heavy basalt quernstones to exchange for English wool, hunting dogs, and slaves. Artisans operated in specialized industrial zones, filling the air with noise and smoke as they worked bone, antler, and leather into everyday goods. Ironsmiths produced tools and weapons, while weavers created heavy textiles using clay loom weights. The local economy was supported by the circulation of small silver coins. A trader might be seen on the Strand carefully counting his sciatas to secure a shipment of foreign goods. It was a noisy and highly productive environment. But unlike the walled Roman enclosure that preceded it, Lundwijk possessed no stone defences. This exposure proved disastrous during the later 9th century. Scandinavian raiding fleets began to target the riches of the English river systems. The undefended beach markets and craft zones of Lundwijk presented a lucrative target. The open settlement became increasingly vulnerable to attack, suffering severe disruptions to its physical safety. As the Viking incursions escalated from seasonal raiding into full-scale armies of conquest, the traditional, open trading beaches were no longer viable. King Alfred the Great of Wessex recognized the desperate need for a radically new strategy to protect his realm. He initiated the creation of a network of fortified strongholds across southern England. When Alfred secured control of London, he executed a masterstroke of urban planning. He recognized the inherent military value of the ancient, ruined Roman walls. Despite centuries of decay and the accumulation of dark earth, the vast stone perimeter still offered a formidable barrier against the Scandinavian fleets. In the year 886, Alfred directed the formal reoccupation of the space within the Roman walls. Rather than a perfectly organized one-time relocation, this was a deliberate strategic shift of population and river traffic back inside the safety of the ancient circuit. Alfred's workers labored in the mud to clear the choked ditches by hand and repair the breached sections of the masonry. A new, pragmatic street grid was laid out across the layer of dark earth. The central thoroughfare of Cheapside was established as a wide, open-air market to serve the needs of the growing populace. Lundinburg emerged. This move secured the future of the river crossing. A new timber bridge was eventually constructed near the site of the ancient span, reasserting physical control over river traffic. The muddy shoreline of the Thames was terraced with wooden revetments and land reclamation dumps. This created deep water wharves that allowed the port to accommodate larger, sea-going merchant vessels. By the middle of the 11th century, the walled enclosure was the leading economic powerhouse of England. Its mercantile wealth and influence far exceeded that of any other English port. When William the Conqueror emerged victorious from the Battle of Hastings in 1066, he knew that to secure the kingdom, he had to secure London. However, He also recognized the imposing nature of its defenses. Rather than attempting a costly frontal assault on the walls, William adopted a strategy of isolation. He marched his army around the perimeter, ravaging the surrounding estates and cutting off supply lines. The leadership within the walls, recognizing their isolated position, negotiated a formal submission at Berkhamsted. To ensure his permanent grip over the restless merchant class, William required a visible manifestation of Norman military strength. He ordered the construction of heavy stone fortresses within the enclosure limits. The most significant of these was the White Tower. Positioned in the southeastern corner, this imposing stone keep was designed to intimidate the local inhabitants and protect the river approach. The architectural placement of the White Tower was carefully calculated by Norman engineers. They deliberately anchored the new fortress onto the surviving sections of the ancient Roman wall. This secured the southeastern flank, while physically binding the new Norman kings to the legacy of the classical past. The Normans constructed additional fortresses, such as Baynard's Castle in the west, further cementing their dominance over the waterfront. They overlaid their feudal military architecture onto the existing Roman and Saxon streets, creating a physical presence that projected unyielding authority over the conquered inhabitants. The physical legacy of Roman Londinium and Saxon Londonburg remains deeply embedded in the modern metropolis. There are no towering Roman temples or intact amphitheatres standing above ground, yet the foundational structure of the streets survives beneath the pavement. The modern financial district is a space whose historic limits remain deeply influenced by the Roman circuit. The curving medieval street patterns, established during Alfred's 9th century reoccupation, continue to dictate the flow of modern traffic. The Bank of England sits mere yards from the buried remains of the Roman Temple of Mithras. Modern glass skyscrapers rise from the same ancient gravel terraces that made the first crossing possible. The layout was born from the supply requirements of a conquering army. It survived devastating fire, centuries of silent abandonment, and dramatic medieval reinvention. The unique geography of the Thames crossing proved remarkably resilient. Today, the distant echoes of that first Roman settlement still resonate through the architecture of the modern capital. They remind us that empires may fall and stones may crumble, but the flow of human ambition remains a constant force in shaping the landscape.